to this event tonight. We're so excited to kick off this poetry series, The Word Made Flesh, with Thomas Lynch. And I'm going to tell you more about his life and his art in just a little bit, but I want to give folks another minute or two to sign on. You'll notice as you come in that you're coming in muted. Don't worry, you're going to have an opportunity to engage with Mr. Lynch towards the end of his reading. He's going to take some questions after the poetry reading. But I'd like to encourage you, if you come in and you're not muted, if you could just go ahead and mute so we could not have any kind of sounds in the background, that would be helpful, especially during the reading itself. But once again, no matter where you're joining us from, whether you've been a lifelong member of St. John's or experiencing St. John's for the very first time tonight, we want to warmly welcome you to this very special event. It's a 4-week poetry series, beginning with Thomas Lynch tonight. And next Wednesday, we're blessed to have McCully Brown, a younger poet from originally from Virginia, starting out on her writing journey. And then we're also going to have Spencer Reece, who's going to be joining us from Queens, New York, where he serves as an Episcopal priest. And then we have Barbara Hamby, who is a local hero here in Tallahassee. She teaches and has taught for many years at Florida State University. You know, we have a saying at St. John's that wherever you are in your spiritual journey, you're welcome here. And thank you for blessing us with your presence at this series. So at this time, I think I'm going to go ahead and introduce our special guest, Thomas Lynch. Again, my name is Dave Killeen. I'm the rector or the senior pastor at St. John's Episcopal Church in Tallahassee. And a few years ago, I led a seminar at St. John's that was entitled The Good Funeral. And it was based on a book by our guest this evening. It was actually co-written by Thomas Lynch, as well as Thomas Long, who is a pastor. In fact, Tom referenced the book just a little while ago when we were talking informally before the event. And that seminar that I led, The Good Funeral, was for the St. John's Episcopal Church Foundation, who is partnering tonight with the church to welcome an extraordinary writer, Thomas Lynch. And it truly is an honor to host him this evening. Mr. Lynch lives in Milford, Michigan, where he's worked as a funeral director for many years. He's a well-known contributor to the New York Times, the New Yorker, Harper's, many other publications. And he's also the author of several books of poetry and nonfiction. And I just learned that in the near future, he's going to have his first novel come out. So stay tuned for that as well. But his latest book is called Bone Rosary. Bone Rosary. I absolutely love this title. I can't wait to find out about a little bit more about why he chose that title. And it is a book that includes new poems, but it's also selected poems from his several books. And he's going to be reading from that tonight. And I want to highly encourage you to think about, after this reading, going out and making sure you get that book from your local bookstore, and so you can read it for yourself. Now, I've been reading Thomas Lynch's work for years. I can't remember whether it was through poetry or his nonfiction that I first experienced him first, but I can tell you one of the most meaningful meditations on death and dying in the United States was a documentary that he was at the very center of that was broadcast on PBS's Frontline. It was entitled The Undertaking. And I think that this should be required viewing for every single person on earth. It is one of the most beautiful, truthful, and powerful tellings of what death and dying is really like in the United States. And so with a topic where there is a lot of avoidance, what you'll see in this special is that Mr. Lynch and the people featured in the documentary meet the topic head on. And all you need to do is Google PBS Frontline, The Undertaking, and you can find you can easily watch that from home. That book, which the documentary is at least in part based on, is called The Undertaking, and it was a National Book Award finalist. And there, Thomas Lynch dispels the myths about his trade. And he writes in that book, just to give you a little taste of what you can expect tonight: I am no more attracted to the dead than the dentist is to your bad gums, the doctor to your rotten innards, or the accountant to your sloppy expense records. So there's some seriousness there, but also a lot of humor. So get ready. It's going to be a fun night. Lynch divides his time between his home in Milford, Michigan, and his ancestral home in Moveen, County Clare, Ireland. If I mispronounce that, Thomas, please correct me. But I hope you'll join me now in welcoming Thomas Lynch. Give him a warm Zoom welcome. And Thomas, you can take it away, my friend.
Thank you so very much. And thank you for that, not only for the invitation to be here, David, but for the that comprehensive and vaguely obituarial introduction, covering, as my wife says, the highlights, you know. So, but whenever I hear such a hyperbolic and generous introduction, I always think I should add to it that I grew up in a household in which the men were expected to become either priests or alcoholics. And I always feel like I should add something like, my name is Tom and I am not a priest. And that said, I was really glad, and it would make you believe, I should confess in advance, that I'm a devoutly lapsed member of the Roman branch of the Catholic Church. And now that I've gotten that taken care of, I do think it's hard to avoid the glimpses we get of the likelihood of a loving God in our life. The idea that Father Killeen, a priest by that name, is one for whom I served as an altar boy for many years. His family were 7 miles north of Moveen, Kilkee, County Clare, on the west coast of Ireland. And so the Killeens and the Lynches were well known in the old country to one another. And so that they would become known in this country to one another. I think I asked you when you first wrote, do you have connections in Clare? Because Killeen is a big name in Clare for the clergy and for usually the guard, which are their police officers. And I think it has something to do with the fact that, well, I couldn't tell you. I think Killeen means small church. Kill is a root word in Irish for church, the church of Seamus or whatever the saint is, you know. But anyway, I'll go too far astray. Maybe I could ask Claire to put up that first image that I sent in, and if it comes, yeah, there it is. This image, and I hope you all can see it, is a panoramic picture taken in 1934 in June. And all those people in those, you know, in those funeral home chairs that they rented for the day, all those are immigrant Irish at the early part of the 20th century. And they've gathered to mark the first solemn high mass by Reverend Thomas P. Lynch, who's the man in the middle under the arch of St. John's Church, by the way, in Jackson, Michigan. The priest's father had come to Jackson from the house I now have in Clare in 1890 because he'd heard that there was good work for unskilled but willing laborers of an Irish sort. They were building the largest walled prison in the country in Jackson. and they needed laborers to do cement work and stone work. And he eventually did janitorial work and then worked in the laundry, and all the way up to a uniformed guard with a pension and the rest of it. So it was the American dream of the Gilded Age for Tom Lynch. One of his sons became a postal employee. Another one became, or a daughter became a teacher, and his third son, the youngest there in the middle, became a priest. These were all soft jobs by Irish standards. And so it was like hitting the trifecta. And this priest had come home from Colorado, where he'd been in the seminary, to say mass in front of his own tribe. These people assembled there. My grandfather is the balding man in the chair in the middle. Next to him is my grandmother, a Dutch woman. The little Methodist lady in the black dress looking out of sorts next to her is her mother, my great grandmother, Roman. Working around the other side, that boy in the knickers and anklets and saddle shoes is my father. He's 10. And something happens between these people. Pictures only catch the moment, of course, and the backstory is very interesting. The priest became a priest because when he was a boy, he survived the Spanish flu, the last pandemic that we endured. And it nearly killed him, but he survived. But he grew up croupy and tubercular and full of trouble. And so eventually they sent him out west to be in the high, dry air of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And he would eventually die 2 years after this picture was taken. And he'd be brought back to Jackson, Michigan. And my father, who was then 12 years old, went with his father to make the funeral arrangements to the funeral home, the Denoyer Funeral Home. And while the adults were talking, boxes and bagpipers and stipendiums for the clergy, my father was wandering through the old house until he came to a door where he saw two men in striped trousers and wingtip shoes dressing the priest in his liturgical vestments, the dead priest who had been sent home collect from the bishop in Santa Fe. And it was to that moment he would ever, after, trace his intention to become a funeral director, an undertaker. And whenever he'd tell us the story, we'd say, well, how come you didn't want to be a priest? And my father was not much given to metaphor, and he simply would say, well, the priest was dead, and left it at that. But 3 generations later, his grandchildren and my nieces and nephews and son and brothers and their families are all operating funeral homes in southeastern Lower Michigan that would never have come into being except for the priest dying and being brought home to his people, and my father witnessing that on the day. Because of that, whenever I see this picture, it reminds me of the sense of calling that all the clergy have. Of course, it's a calling that's mostly silent, but it requires great faith. So here's a poem called Calling. I should say also, I'm going to read a few poems, not too many. I get tired of the sound of my own voice fairly quickly. And if you then want to ask some questions, that'll be jolly, because I like answering questions. And if I don't know the answer, I just make something up, which is what writers mostly do. And but if you don't have any questions, I have about 2 hours worth of poems I can unleash on you. So it's better to kind of form 1 or 2 questions. And I often tell audiences I am skilled at sonnets and embalming, and I'll talk to you about anything between those 2 poles. So ask away. You can't hurt my feelings. I've raised teenagers, so that work is done. Calling. We Catholic boys all listened for the call, the voice of God exquisite in our ears. Come, follow me. Or as it was with Paul, thunder, lightning, the bang and whisper by which God makes his will known to us all. Be fruitful, but not apples. Is that clear? Or as it was with Noah, build an ark. Or Abram, prove your faith, men. Kill your boy. Or Moses, so you're thirsty, smite the rock. Or Job out of the whirlwind, gird your loins. Or that fervent girl child, Joan of Arc, who burned but never renounced her voices. Belief is easy when God speaks to us. The ordinary silence, there's the thing, the soul-consuming quiet, the heavens hush that sets even the pious wondering. Lord, spare us all, we doubting Thomases, who even with a trembling finger in the wound still ask aloud, my Lord, my God, ever curious, too inquisitive. I was named after a father, Tom, my father's uncle, Thomas Patrick Lynch, a sickly boy who died before his time, 1904 to 1936, saving Apaches at Rancho de Tawas, breathing from easier that rarefied air of the Sangre de Cristo mountains. The blood of Christ, when he was done, ran clear. Once in the basement of my grandparents' house, I found his cassock and Roman collar, hanging from a rafter, blessed and bodiless, and under it a trunk of priestly things, surplice and beretta, bright chalices, a sick call kit, and leather breviary. I tried them all, though nothing seemed to fit. All the same, I kept on listening. And I served at altar for our parish priest, the Reverend Thomas Kenny, never Tom, never wavering, never doubtful in the least, a holy Roman Irish Catholic man who lost his bearings when they Englished everything, like Barry Fitzgerald or Father Flanagan. After morning masses, he'd make me kneel for half an hour in the back of church to offer thanksgiving for the holy meal I was after having in the Eucharist. Be stingy with the Lord, boyo, and he'll be stingy in return. He kept a list of saints and shortcomings, shelts and shelt nots, mortal, venial, deadly and cardinal sins, contrary virtues, graces, gifts of God, the glorious and sorrowful mysteries, holy days, first Fridays, stations of the cross, corporal and spiritual works of mercy. It was a language that I learned to speak. Lovely and Latin, a sort of second tongue. My parents and peoples, the nuns and priests, that rose in the air like incense and song, ghostly and Gregorian, like memories, first gushing, then going, but never gone. And I am listening still. We're given 2 ears and 1 mouth for good reason. Pray to know God's purpose and you will. So said the old priest, and I believed him. Carpe momentum, boy. Each minute is a gift. And though I wonder still, sometimes I seize it. Sometimes I see that dead priest in my dreams in the basement of Denoyer's funeral home in Jackson, Michigan. He's on the table. The train has brought him home from Santa Fe. 2 men in shirt sleeves vest and casket him, while my father, just gone 12, stands in the door, unnoticed, watching everything. Upstairs, his father's organizing things. The flowers, mass and burial, a stone. The 5th of August, 1936, that Wednesday morning when our dad was called, or so he always told us after that, to this life's work between the quick and dead. And so we do these generations since. My brothers, sisters, sons and daughter all carry on as if we'd heard it too. That silence or that summons, who's to know? Whether faith moves mountains or if mountains move. So that kind of gives you an idea of the watershed moment in our family's life that sort of gave us our calling to undertaking. And after 50 years of undertaking, I just think I'm very fortunate that I had sort of that sense of purpose always. It wasn't just a living; it was a way of life for us, and it became the done thing for all of us. Here's a poem. Well, maybe I'll get these other images out of the way. Claire, do you have that book cover, The Depositions? Maybe we can put that up, because I'm interested in the cover art for that. This is the book cover of selected essays, new and selected essays that I published last year. And I was kind of struck by the fact that the image was overtaken by this foreground in which all the text about the title and the author and the here and there of it. But what I was really drawn to was that open palm in the middle of the picture. So I was lucky to speak to the book designer from the publisher in New York, and she said that the image was one that they borrowed from the Wellcome collection in London. And so the image is called "The Sick of the Palsy is Healed and His Sins Forgiven." And I think Claire has an image of the thing uncovered. There it is. I know this because I went to London, and whilst there, I went to the Wellcome collection, and after they disabused me of, any pens or objects with which I might do art terror, they let me see this in the actual fact of it. And it's this wonderful engraving, I think done in the late 18th century. James Newton was the engraver, and it depicts a scene that comes from, I think this, we read it in 3 of the 4 Gospels, but the one that I always liked the best was in the Gospel of Mark, that talks about, Jesus is home in Capernaum, and this paralytic can't get into the house because of the crowd that surrounds a man who heals people of whatever illness or trouble they have. So 4 of his friends carried him up onto the roof, and as you can see in this image, they tore the roof apart and let him down on ropes between the rafters to the foot of the healer on the day, who immediately offers him as a reward for his faith the forgiveness of sins. Back in the corner there on the right-hand side, you can see what I call the begrudgers. There's some on the left-hand side too. And in the scripture, they're beginning to say that who is this man, Jesus, who is offering the forgiveness of sins? Only God can do that. Now, because Jesus is Jesus, he knows the hearts of these begrudgers. So he turns to them and says, well, what kind of a miracle do you want? Would you rather see something remarkable? I mean, the question he poses is the miracle we see more impressive than the miracle we don't see, but is nonetheless there? And so then he tells the paralytic to stand and walk, which he does immediately. And everybody is shocked and amazed. And this is among the miracles leading up to the resurrection of Lazarus that gets Jesus in trouble with the occupying Romans and their lethal governors and leads to the crucifixion some chapters later. But whenever I look at this image and I think of how fortunate that man was to have friends, I'm reminded of the poem called Miracle by Seamus Heaney in his book Human Chain, in which he says, you know, keep in mind that it's not just the paralytic walking or Jesus forgiving him. Look at those guys up on the roof. Isn't it a miracle to have such friends who will get you where you need to go? In any event, it's always taken my imagination. So this is a poem called The Sick of the Palsy is Healed and His Sins Forgiven, which is exactly the reverse of how it happens in the scripture. The first thing that's happened is he's forgiven. But here we go. The graver's title tells it in reverse. So which the greater miracle, we're asked? To cleanse the soul or cure paralysis? The mercy hidden or made manifest? The King James Version has forgiveness first, the sins remission quite invisible, and then to quiet the scribes and Pharisees, arise, he says, take up your bed and walk. Wherefore begrudgers and their begrudging talk of blasphemy and sacrilege are hushed. The palsied man stands up and saunters off, bedroll and ropes gathered under his arm. Behold, we never saw a thing like that. The Savior's plain on this. It's faith that saves. The boyos on the roof, like pallbearers, delivered of their corpse and coffin straps, their thankless jobs, all heft and heave and lift, done for yet another day, so they begin taking up their shovels, sods and tiles, to mend the mess they've made of it again. I always wondered, what did they do with the hole in the roof? And it occurred to me that probably the guys that brought the lame man in had to fix it. So here's another poem written in England, or the germ of it happened in England. It's called Digitus Paterni Dexteri, which is basically the finger of creation, the hand of God. We think of it as that hand reaching across the Sistine Chapel roof, you know? And this has nothing to do with the Sistine Chapel. It had to do with stopping for tea in an outdoor garden in Ledbury. And I was there to take part in a poetry festival. And I traveled with a young assistant who was handling these ivies that were growing out of the brick wall. And she wanted to know more about them. She's something of a horticulturalist. And she turned to the waitress and said, do you know the name of these? And the rest is in the poem. So here it goes. Digitus Paterni Dexteri. Toadflax, pennywort, mother of thousands. Cymbellaria moralis, ivy blooms out the brick wall of a cafe garden, sunlit in the common era. It is late June on Church Lane in Ledbury, Herefordshire. And we have settled in for cakes and tea, a bottle of designer lemonade, Fentiman's natural, botanically brewed, before we go to the poetry do. Your fingers combing through the pink wallflowers, you query the waitress, might she know the name, these symbol-shaped leaves, these wee snapdragons? Kenilworth ivy? Wandering sailor? It's everywhere and comes back every year. The languor of your hand's loose scrutiny, like a monk at manuscript or a nun at beads, or Adam naming animals and Eve, or arching towards creation's outstretched reach whilst lazing in the ceiling's masterpiece, we weary of sorting the beauty of being. I often wondered, you know, in the creation story in Genesis, Adam gets to point his finger and say, orangutan, warthog, whatever, Eve. And I often wondered if God had simply had the woman do the naming. Maybe we'd have better names for things. I don't know, but I understand that digital finger that names and claims is partaking in creation in a way that men like to assign to themselves. But from my own experience, I'd have to say that women are at least, well, they're more than that. So they should have got the naming privileges. So here's one called He Posits Certain Mysteries. And it's about a boy who jumped from a cliff in West Clare into the Shannon, into the ocean, into the estuary, and drowned. The body of the boy who took his flight off the cliff at Kilclower into the sea was hauled up by curragh men out at first light fishing mackerel in the estuary. No requiems or rosaries, said the priest, nor consecrated ground for burial. As if the boy had flown outside the pale of mercy or redemption or God's love. Forgive them, for they know not what they do, quoth Argyle to the corpse's people, who heard in what he said a sort of riddle, as if he meant their co-religionist and not their sodden, sadly broken boy. Either way, they took some comfort in it and readied better than accustomed fare of food and spirits by their own reckoning, the greater sin, the greater soul, the toll. But Argyle refused their shilling coin and helped them build a box and dig a grave. Your boy's no profligate or prodigal, he said, only a wounded pilgrim like us all. What say his leaping was a leap of faith into his father's beckoning embrace. They killed no fatted calf. They filled the hole. That poem is one in a series of poems about a sin eater. And the sin eater was sort of a secular priest, I suppose. He'd go around the parish and for a bowl full of beer and a sup of bread and a sixpence, he would eat the sins and the perdition accruing to them of the deceased. And this substitutionary atonement upon which a good deal of Christianity is built he was in competition with the church directly, though he didn't think of it that way. He thought of it as a kindness. In any event, I think I have 18 or 20 of those sin eater poems. He was named Argyle because it's the only reliably Scots-Irish thing I could think of, like Argyle socks. And it also reminded me of our guile, our guilt, which was, after all, the thing he was trying to remove. Here's another poem about this difficult year. This is the last poem that I wrote that got into this collection. It's called Corinne Among the Fronds of Basil. As Father Killeen knows, when you have an assistant who is more capable, the more you ask them to do, the more the assistant does. And so you keep asking more and more things of the assistant. And during this pestilent year, Corinne did all my grocery shopping and would bring the groceries and make a meal and leave the place tidied and listen to whatever I was working on in my literary life. And then she'd go back to her own life. Last September, just before the first frost here in northern Michigan, she went out and saved a big bunch of overgrown basil from my kitchen garden. And she brought it in and began to look at it for signs of damage. There was none. It became a pesto within a couple minutes, it seemed. But it put me in mind of those pre-Raphaelite paintings of, is it Isabella and the jar of basil, and in the jar is where the head of Isabella's murdered lover, Lorenzo, I think his name is. John Keats wrote a long poem about it, which he stole from, I think, Boccaccio. So it's one poet stealing from another, and an artist stealing from both of them. And a century and a half later, the vision of a woman with a bunch of basil made me think of it too. It also gave me an opportunity to talk about all the summer's losses, which included my daughter's death by suicide last July, and which made the poem I'm just after reading about that boy who leapt into the sea so relevant to me, because I couldn't imagine not seeing the opening, beckoning arms of another reality, whatever we name it, that was welcoming and warming and protective. So they always talk about death by suicide as a lack of faith. I think it might require more faith than most of us have. I don't know. I mean, it's a mystery before which we mostly just sit in silence. So here's a poem called Corinne Among the Fronds of Basil. The leafy basil from the garden fills the kitchen with a whiff of summer's losses, and frames the figure of a prepossessing girl among these fronds saved from the coming frosts. She adds pine nuts and olive oil, shredded Parmesan, fine crushed bulbs of garlic pressed into a greeny pesto, and boils pasta, as if the sky weren't actually falling. Hell and high water in one dire week, the bottoms falling out of everything, 200,000 dead of pestilence, my long lost daughter Heather lost for keeps, halfway through a leap year taking her leap into the beckoning embrace of the abyss, desperate for some riddance, cold release. We got her home, alas, to let her go again. And good John Lewis gone to his reward, who stood upright on Black Lives Matter Plaza. No justice, no peace, our marching anthem, to see him crossing Edmund Pettus Bridge, bludgeoned, horizontal and victorious. And word will come tonight of RBG, notorious for justice and dissent, equality of genders, loves and sexes, against all poverties and contagions. Corinne upholds these end of summer leaves with gratitude against begrudgeries. And maybe two more. I think Dante said that. And okay. Oh, this is called Mourning Among Piebalds. Among the things I keep in County Clare in Ireland, where I have this little hovel left to me by my cousins Tommy and Nora Lynch. Some years ago, in order to keep the lawn mowed, this is a farming townland, and I didn't want to get a lawnmower, so I bought a jackass. I named him Charles because his ears put me in mind of the the prince on the neighboring island. And then I got a mare ass and called her Camilla because they were much in the news, the two of them, in their romance, you know. And so Charles and Camilla like other mammals, fell into all sorts of mischief, which eventuated every 11 months or so in another little foal. And so now I have, at one point I had 6 or 7 of them. I started giving them away like door prizes, but I've kept 3 or 4 of them. And when they stand out in the haggard, looking into the corner with such contentment in their eyes, I think, what a lucky man I am, because I go out there and stand with them. And it's a better form of meditation than I've ever achieved in any church or any, it's the best form of meditation I know. So this poem, Morning Among Piebalds, and then I'll finish with one other, and then it would be time for those Stump the Undertaker questions. And otherwise I'll have more poems. So Morning Among Piebalds. This standing stillness among ruminants inclines towards contemplation, perfectly indifferent to a day's contingencies, news of the world, some word on the weather. And as for speaking to one another, only insofar as communicants extend their tongues, agape for Eucharist. We yawn along a day's communion rail. This presence, whether virtual or real, we hunger after such companionships. And so my piebald asses lolling move in their haphazard unison as if the hedge and green sword were their common table. The silence hums a sort of reverence for being and creation and the life insouciant, still mindlessly alive. And this is a poem I wrote, I think 20 years ago now, maybe. Must be, because it's called Refusing at 52 to Write Sonnets. I used to write a sonnet every day for my birthday, which comes in October, because I figured at least I'd have a poem done for the year, So, and a sonnet's an easy thing. You knock out 14 lines and you wrap it up. Done and dusted, as we say in Clare. And but the older we get, the less we count. Now, you can parse that when you get home, but it is true, which accounts for the 15 lines of this poem, which I thought were only 14, which accounts for the title, which is Refusing at 52 to Write Sonnets, which I call a great save. I really do. So it's older than the newer poems in this selected poems. I want to say before I read it that among the other losses last year was my agent, Richard McDonough, who had advanced my cause with publishers for, 30 years before that. And he died last summer of his age and infirmity. And I miss him an awful lot. The last deal he made was to settle 2 books with a new press, because I had sort of come into conflict with my old press, and we fired one another happily. It was a good riddance. But the new press that he settled this book with was the house of David R. Godine in Boston. People my age know David Godine as a bookseller who went selling books out of his car to bookstores all over the country. This is the book they made for me called Bone Rosary, in which they put together all my favorite older poems and 40 or more pages of new poems. It is the prettiest book I've ever published. It is so handsome and so close to what I had in mind when I wanted to highlight these. And I have to thank Josh Bodwell for the work he did in acquiring this book, bringing this book into being, and making it such a beautiful thing for me to hold. Poets, as all of you know, are internationally ignored. They don't, nobody buys poetry books. I want to hold this up and say to you that, those pesky in-laws in your family that seem to have everything when it comes to their birthday or Christmas? They don't have this. And if you give them this, one of the things it tells them is that you think they read poems. Now, if you compare that to, say, a bottle of scotch, which says you think they drink, they cost about the same. So I'm going to advance the cause of poetry with my name on it, but any name will do. I think it was Don Marquis who said some years ago that publishing poetry is like casting rose petals into the Grand Canyon and hoping to hear the echo. Well, when you have someone like the House of David Godine and Josh Bodwell, properly named, I might add, and his wife who designed this beautiful book, when that all comes to pass for a cause like this old fart's poetry, then I say, do them the kindness of at least getting one on the shelf in your brother-in-law's house this year. And, maybe if your brother-in-law is like some of my brothers-in-law, it'll do them no harm or only a little harm, which, I'm just saying. And thank you for your kind attention to this, because it's a little bit like going to the shrink online and not getting a bill when it's over. So thank you very much for your attention to this. I'm outnumbered. I'm outnumbered by enough people that I can put it in my obituary, and I will. Thank you very much, Father, and thank you very much, Mother, and thank you very much, Claire, and everybody else who's associated with this. So, refusing at 52 to write sonnets. It came to him that he could nearly count how many Octobers he had left to him, in increments of 10 or say 11, thus 63, 74, 85. He couldn't see himself at 96. Humanity's advances notwithstanding in healthcare, self-help, or New Age regimens. What with his habits and family history, the end, he thought, is nearer than you think. The future thus confined to its contingencies. The present moment opens like a gift. The balding month, the gray week, the blue morning, the hours routine, the minutes passing glance, all seem like godsends now. And what to make of this? At the end, the word that comes to us is thanks. Thanks.
Thomas Lynch, we thank you, and we do not want this reading to be done and dusted. We do have some time for Q&A, and friends, you can submit your questions using the chat function. You can also, I'm sorry, did someone have a question there? Okay, so you can submit those questions on the chat, and we'll be checking those out, and we'll offer them up to Richard says this has been a solid, sobering, and uplifting hour of poetry and commentary. Fascinated by how ritual, church tradition, and language have informed a lifetime of poetry with you. Thank you, Richard, so much for that comment. Chrissy from Springfield, Missouri says, it's so good to hear you speak again. I got your book from my mom for Mother's Day. Good for you, Chrissy. That's wonderful. And you're our favorite internationally known poet, or unknown poet, as she's
Thanks,
joking. Mary says, such a treat to hear you read your poems. Kenneth thanks you as well. And Elizabeth has a question. And by the way, she cherishes you, and because you have buried several members of your family, of her family. And wow, that's very powerful. Thank you, Elizabeth, for being with us. And the question, Thomas, is what do you feel that Americans lack the most from the ritual of grieving?
I think that's a very good question. When my daughter died this past summer, she died in California, and I've always said that the living get where they need to be by getting the dead where they need to go. That's what makes for a good funeral. But I think one of the great sadnesses of our culture, and funeral directors are as much to blame for this as the public at large, is that oftentimes we farm out to the professional the best part of the work that has to be done. It is the heavy lift. It is the large muscle, the heart, the shoulder, that gets the real grief work done. And so I say if we go the distance with our dead, there is a sense of having done what we could, a sense of having completed, gotten them on their way in a journey that we can't go with them, but we go as far as we can and then bid them a fare thee well. When we see on the evening news the open pyres in Calcutta, we understand that as a culture that has buried its dead, we never backed away from going to the graveside. It's where most of the good ceremonies take place because they involve the open ground and Mother Earth, as we call her. And but now we cremate 60% of our dead, but rarely, if ever, will family accompany the dead to the fire. We like the fire for its industrial efficiency and not incidentally for its lower costs. But we don't understand the powerful metaphors of purifying and release and the holy Euraises that attend Pentecost. Those are tongues of fire. If we want to understand the spirit to whom we commend our dead, we better understand fire better. And the best way to do it is to go and watch, or at least to go and get them where they need to go, to place the body in the retort or whatever. We're probably not going to go to public cremation as they do in India. Anyway, I think if we got more into doing for our own with the, I'm glad to assist, but I think too often funeral directors do the heavy lift that family should be doing,
Thomas, thank you for that. And it made me think about when my family and I buried my grandfather. And I was a teenager at the time in Florida, and we went down. It was summertime and blazing hot. And I caught a weird summer cold where I had a fever. Mm-hmm. And I just remember pallbearing and the weight of the casket on my shoulder and the fever that I had and that heavy lift. And you made me remember what I had not remembered in many years, and how important that can be for the living to be a part of that heavy lift. We have some additional questions that have come in, and I think what I'd like to do maybe is try to synthesize these a little bit. My good friend Alyssa asks about commenting on the impact of COVID on Undertaking, and Carol Newman has a similar, but more of a on the art side. How will this past terrifying year of COVID disease, death, and isolation and denial impact writers, especially poets? Thomas, do you want to take those questions?
I think poets will find a way to rise to the occasion. Poetry is the art of the unspeakable, and it's so yeah. There's been much unspeakable about the year we've just put behind us, and the year, by the way, in front of us. Um, all of our instincts to run towards the sadness have been countervailed by our fears of contagion and the public health. So where we would be encouraged to gather, we are now encouraged to isolate. So I think we're going to have grieving people hobbled by the distance we've had to keep, the social distance we've had to keep, and we should be alert to that in the months and years ahead of us immediately, to be very tender with the many families who have endured a loss that they could not do the necessary things, nor could they have the necessary community around them, because it is true that when we share grief, it seems to diminish. It's just more people shouldering their part of the load. But we had, everybody in the country had different guidelines and limits on how many could attend. Churches were closed or open only to immediate family. I've spent more time watching funerals in West Clare on this computer, and I go to funerals, and I'm glad to be able to have the technology. But we have been cruelly done by this pandemic, and I dare say cruelly done by an awful lot of our, well, I'll just leave it there.
Thomas, thank you. And I think you answered Laurel's question about poetry in terms of its special role, which is, I think, can you maybe repeat? I think you said something. It's the art of speaking the unspeakable. Is that correct? Or
yeah, poetry is raised speech, much the same, Father, as prayer. We don't get it all the time, but we assemble the metaphors, we assemble the incantations, the lamentations, and we raise them up with the crazy sense that somebody is listening. And then we find out maybe they are, or somebody is listening, or maybe not. I don't know. But I think one of the things about grief is it gets us very close to those inklings we're supposed to have. I'm a part of a fellowship that holds that the spiritual life is not a theory, we have to live it. So if we live a life as if we are happily haunted by our cloud of witnesses, and we all have a list of the people in that cloud of witnesses. I always think of it in that old movie of To Kill a Mockingbird. And when Pastor Sykes is up in the mezzanine of the courthouse, and Gregory Peck has lost his case because Tom is going to jail. He'll die that same night by the resident racism. But Pastor Sykes is in the upper deck where people of color are allowed to watch what goes on in the courthouse. And so are the son and daughter, Jem and Scout, I believe, the son and daughter of the attorney, Atticus Finch, the loser on the day. And Reverend Sykes, a kindly bespectacled black man, says, as Atticus is leaving beleagueredly the courtroom, "Stand up, Jem. Stand up, Scout. Your father is passing." I think if there's anything true about Christianity, is that it's faith for losers, because its great spectacles are spectacles of loss. And the fact that mercy and love abounds through just such situations, it's astonishing. It is astonishing. That's where, when John says God is love, he doesn't say God's like love, he says God's love. So the place you feel a lot of love, at least I speaking from my experience, is when your heart is broken.
Thank you so much. Regina shares that you buried 4 members of her family. She is joining us from the Shenandoah Valley. However, 4 members of her family you helped to bury. She's appreciative. She also sends her condolences on the loss of your daughter and appreciation for your reading tonight. And we have many other wonderful questions and comments there in the chat. We're thankful for all of you. If you joined us a little bit late, my name is Dave Killeen. I'm the rector or senior pastor at St. John's Episcopal Church in Tallahassee. And whether you're joining us from Tallahassee or from around the country, once again, I want to welcome you. So grateful that you joined us this evening. Want to encourage you to fill out a digital welcome card. You'll find that on the St. John's website, and a member of the clergy team will be in touch with you to welcome you, whether you're local or joining us nationally. I'm extremely grateful to the St. John's Episcopal Church Foundation for co-offering this reading tonight. To find out more about St. John's Foundation, you can go to our website, where you can read all about the 1829 Legacy Society and find out how you can have a lasting and meaningful legacy that will strengthen our common ministries here at St. John's. Next week, as I said earlier, we're going to be welcoming Molly McCully Brown, a poet from Virginia. She teaches at Old Dominion. She has a new book of essays that has just come out called Places I've Brought My Body. She's also a poet, and I think you're going to absolutely love her reading. So we want to welcome you. Tell your friends. Please invite your friends and family. All are welcome to this series. It's going to be the same place, the same time each week on Zoom. And Thomas Lynch, please know how deeply grateful we are to you for the generous gift of your time and these beautiful poems and your beautiful meditations on your poems. And to be honest with you, you had me laughing so much. You are hilarious. I deeply appreciate your sense of humor, and I really do want to connect with you on Irish roots. I will be in touch. But we're going to bring tonight to a close with a prayer. And so please, friends, just join me in prayer. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous. And all for your love's sake. Amen. Thomas, thank you again, and may you all have a peaceful night. Take care, everyone.
All righty, over and out. Thank you.